I used to believe that if I loved my son unconditionally and supported his every dream, he would one day appreciate the sacrifices I made for our family. But I never imagined that Richard, the boy I raised alone after his father abandoned us, would deliberately exclude me from family gatherings and holiday photos once he married Vanessa. What he didn't know was that the sprawling colonial house in Pinecrest Estates they'd been saving for, the one they called their forever home, had quietly been in my name since before Vanessa even entered our lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moment I realized what was happening still burns in my memory. It was Christmas Eve at Richard and Vanessa's downtown apartment. Their living room was filled with Vanessa's relatives, her parents Gerald and Patricia, her sister with her, husband, and cousins who barely acknowledged my presence. I sat alone on a small chair in the corner, watching as Richard carried around trays of the appetizers I had spent all morning preparing. "Everyone gather for the family Christmas photo," Vanessa called out, her voice carrying that artificial cheerfulness that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. I smoothed my red sweater, the one I'd bought specifically for this occasion, and started to rise from my seat. Vanessa glanced at me, her smile fixed firmly in place. "Eleanor, would you mind taking the picture? We want to get the whole family together." The whole family. As if I weren't part of it. As if I hadn't been the only family Richard had known for most of his life. I nodded silently and accepted the camera. This wasn't the first slight I'd endured since Richard married Vanessa 3 years ago. There had been their housewarming, where I was introduced to their friends as Richard's mother, rather than by my name. Then their anniversary dinner, where I was seated at a separate table with distant relatives while the immediate family enjoyed the main table. But this was the first time they'd so openly excluded me from a family tradition. "Dad, Mom should be in this picture," Richard said, hesitating briefly as he noticed my expression. Before he could insist, Patricia stepped in, adjusting her designer glasses. "Eleanor doesn't mind, does she? We so rarely have everyone together like this." I met my son's eyes briefly and saw a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or conflict. But then Vanessa slipped her arm through his and pulled him back to the group. "It's fine, honey. Eleanor's happy to take the photo, right?" Eleanor. Not Mom, not Mother. Just Eleanor, like I was some distant acquaintance. I pressed the button multiple times as instructed, capturing their perfect family moment while standing on the outside looking in. Later that night, when I checked social media, I saw the photos prominently displayed with the caption, "So blessed to spend Christmas with family." Not a mention of me, though I had brought the turkey, homemade cranberry sauce, and 3 different desserts. That evening, as I drove back to my modest apartment in Westlake Village, fighting back tears I promised would be the last I'd shed over Richard and Vanessa, I made a decision. The hurt crystallized into something stronger, something that would not bend or break again. For 3 years I'd watched as Vanessa systematically minimized my role in Richard's life. It had started subtly after their honeymoon, forgotten invitations to Sunday dinners, last-minute changes to plans we'd made, my calls to Richard increasingly intercepted by Vanessa. My son, eager to keep peace in his new marriage, made excuses that even he didn't seem to fully believe. "She's just protective of our time together, Mom," he'd say. Or, "Vanessa's under a lot of pressure at her law firm." The explanations grew, weaker as the distance between us widened. What made it all the more painful was how openly they discussed their dreams in front of me, almost as if I weren't there. The colonial house on Oakmont Drive in Pinecrest Estates, the one with the circular driveway and grand entrance, had become their obsession. At every gathering, Vanessa would bring it up, showing new pictures on her phone. "The Mitchells are finally selling," she'd announced that very Christmas Eve, passing her phone around to her family. "We've been saving every penny. Another year or 2, and we'll have enough for the down payment. No one bothered to show me the pictures. I wasn't part of this conversation, this dream, this future. What they didn't know, what Richard had apparently forgotten, was that the house at 47 Oakmont Drive had been in my late husband's family for generations. When James died unexpectedly 20 years ago, he left it in my name, along with specific instructions in his will. I had been renting it to the Mitchells all these years, using the income to put Richard through college and help him establish his career. The irony wasn't lost on me. Vanessa was systematically pushing out the very woman who held the keys to the future they so desperately wanted. That night, after the Christmas photo incident, I called my attorney, Martin Green, who had managed my affairs since James's death. "I think it's time we discuss the house on Oakmont Drive," I told him, my voice steadier than it had been all day. "I believe I'm ready to make some changes to the arrangement." Martin, always perceptive, asked carefully, "Does this have something to do with Richard and his wife?" "Yes," I replied simply. "It has everything to do with them." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 days after Christmas, I received a text message from Richard asking if I could watch their dog, Baxter, while they visited Vanessa's parents in Redwood Shores for New Year's. It wasn't the first time they'd asked for this favor. Baxter and I had always shared a special bond, even if his owners seemed to have forgotten theirs with me. "Of course," I replied immediately. "When will you drop him off?" "Actually, we're running late. Could you pick him up? The spare key is under the planter." That's how I found myself in their apartment on the morning of December 27th, letting myself in while they hurriedly packed their suitcases in the bedroom. Baxter greeted me with enthusiastic jumps and licks, his tail wagging so hard his entire body shook. "Hey there, sweet boy," I whispered, bending down to scratch behind his ears. "At least someone's happy to see me." I could hear Richard and Vanessa's muffled voices from the bedroom, discussing last-minute packing details. Not wanting to interrupt, I decided to gather Baxter's things: his food, favorite toys, the special orthopedic bed he needed for his arthritic joints. As I opened the hall closet where they normally kept his supplies, a large manila envelope slid from the top shelf and scattered papers across the hardwood floor. Kneeling to collect them, I froze when I saw what they were. Financial statements, printed emails between Vanessa and a real estate agent, and a half-completed mortgage application for 47 Oakmont Drive. My hands trembled as I gathered the documents, my eyes catching phrases like, "elderly seller may be motivated," and "potential for aggressive negotiation given the owner's age." But it was a printed email thread between Vanessa and her mother that made my blood run cold. "I've been researching Eleanor's finances," Vanessa had written. "The property tax records show she's owned that house for decades. With her fixed income, she'll jump at our offer even if it's below market. Richard says she's always been sentimental about family legacy." Patricia's response was even more cutting. "Perfect strategy. Once you secure the house, you can finally create some distance. Richard's attachment to his mother has gone on long enough. A clean break would be best for everyone." The final email in the thread was dated just 3 days before Christmas. "Holiday update. Eleanor continues to be oblivious. Richard is finally seeing things my way regarding limited contact. Operation Dream Home proceeding as planned." Operation Dream Home. They had turned my exclusion, my pain, into some sort of strategic game. I sat on the floor, papers clutched against my chest, as the full reality washed over me. This wasn't just about holiday photos or seating arrangements. This was a calculated campaign to push me out of Richard's life completely, using my own property as the final prize. The bathroom door opened and Richard emerged, rolling his sleeves down. He startled when he saw me sitting on the floor. "Mom, I didn't hear you come in." His eyes dropped to the papers in my hands, and his expression shifted from surprise to something I'd never seen directed at me before. Panic, followed quickly by defensive anger. "What are you doing going through our private things?" Before I could respond, Vanessa appeared behind him. She assessed the situation with alarming speed, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the emails in my hands. "Eleanor," she said, her voice glacial. "Those fell while I was getting Baxter's things," I explained quietly, rising to my feet with as much dignity as I could muster. "I was picking them up." "And reading them, apparently," Vanessa snapped, stepping forward to snatch the papers from my hands. I turned to Richard, searching his face for any sign of the son I'd raised, the boy who'd crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd defended me fiercely when classmates made comments about our modest lifestyle, the young man who'd promised, "It'll always be you and me against the world, Mom." "Is this true?" I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you planning to make an offer on the Oakmont property?" Richard's eyes couldn't meet mine. "We've been saving," he mumbled. "It's a good investment opportunity." "And what about this?" I held up the email I still clutched, the one about creating distance, about a clean break. His face paled. Vanessa stepped between us, her perfect posture radiating authority. "That was a private conversation," she said coldly. "And frankly, Eleanor, our relationship with you isn't really relevant to our housing decisions. Not relevant. 30 years of motherhood, of sacrifice, of unconditional love. Not relevant." "Richard?" I prompted, stepping around Vanessa to face my son directly. "Is that how you feel? That I'm not relevant?" His hesitation told me everything. "Mom, you're twisting things. We're just trying to build our own life. The house is a good opportunity, and yes, we've been thinking that maybe some boundaries would be healthy." "Boundaries," I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "Is that what you call excluding me from family photos? Seating me with strangers at your anniversary dinner? Introducing me as Richard's mother instead of by my name?" Vanessa's exasperated sigh cut through the tension. "Eleanor, families evolve. Richard and I need to establish our own traditions, our own circle. It's perfectly normal." "Normal," I echoed, looking between them. "Is it normal to write emails about Operation Dream Home? To discuss how to manipulate an elderly seller because of her fixed income?" Richard at least had the decency to look ashamed. We didn't mean—" "What didn't you mean, Richard?" My voice grew stronger with each word. "Didn't mean for me to find out? Didn't mean to hurt me while you were pushing me out of your life? Or didn't mean to use my financial situation against me?" Baxter whined softly, sensing the tension. I reached down to stroke his head, drawing strength from his simple, uncomplicated affection. "I think I should go," I said finally, clipping Baxter's leash to his collar. "I'll take good care of him while you're away." "Mom, wait," Richard started, but Vanessa placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let her go," she said. "We'll discuss this when we get back. We're already running late." As I walked to the door, Baxter trotting faithfully beside me, I turned one last time. "Just so you know, Richard, I've never been oblivious. Not to Vanessa's campaign to diminish me, not to your willingness to let her do it, and certainly not to what's happening with the Oakmont property." The stunned look on both their faces might have been satisfying under different circumstances. Instead, it just felt hollow, like everything else about our relationship these past 3 years. "Enjoy your trip to Redwood Shores," I said quietly. "We'll talk when you return." The drive home was a blur. Baxter sat beside me in the passenger seat, occasionally nudging my arm with his nose as if offering comfort. My mind raced through memories, both recent and distant, Richard's childhood, his wedding day when I danced with him and whispered how proud his father would have been, the gradual chill that had set in after Vanessa entered our lives. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, a strange calm had settled over me. The shock and hurt remained, but something else was emerging. Something that felt surprisingly like liberation. For years, I'd been trying to maintain a relationship that Richard and Vanessa had already decided to discard. I'd been fighting for scraps of affection, for minimal inclusion, making myself smaller and less demanding in hopes of being allowed to remain in their lives. That night, as Baxter curled up on the bed beside me, I reached for my phone and dialed. "Martin's number again." "I need you to pull the property records for 47 Oakmont," I said when he answered, "and then I want you to draft a letter." "What kind of letter?" he asked. I stroked Baxter's soft fur, feeling more clear-headed than I had in years. "A reality check," I replied. "It's time Richard and Vanessa learned exactly who owns their dream house." The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a strange limbo. With Baxter as my only companion, I found myself reflecting on the long, winding path that had led to this moment. Each morning, we walked through Westlake Park, the winter, air crisp and clarifying, and each evening I sorted through old photo albums and documents that told the story of a family, my family, that had somehow lost its way. One evening, while Baxter dozed by the radiator, I pulled out a weathered leather box from the back of my closet. Inside were the papers James had left in order, even as his health failed him. My late husband had always been meticulous about such things. Preparation. "Isn't pessimism, Eleanor, it's protection," he would say. Among the documents was the original deed to 47 Oakmont Drive, dated 1978, the year we married. I ran my fingers over James's signature, remembering the day we'd received the house as a wedding gift from his grandfather. We hadn't lived there, ourselves. We were young and preferred the vibrancy of downtown to the quiet lanes of Pinecrest Estates. Instead, we'd decided to rent it out, using the income to build our savings while we lived in a modest apartment not unlike the one I occupied. "Now, we'll move there someday," James had promised, "when we're ready for the white picket fence and the 2.5 kids." But someday never came. James's architecture firm sent him to oversee a project in Laketon, and I'd gone with him, teaching at the local elementary school. We'd rented the Oakmont house to a young professor and his wife, the first in a long line of tenants. After a few years, we'd welcomed Richard into our lives, completing our small family in a way we hadn't known we needed. My fingers traced a family photo from 1990. Richard at 5 years old, sitting on James's shoulders in front of our Laketon bungalow, both of them beaming with identical smiles. I remembered taking that picture, laughing as James pretended to stagger under our son's weight. We'd been happy then, genuinely happy, in a way that made the small house feel like more than enough. James never did see his ancestral home again. The car accident that took him happened on a rainy Tuesday in 1998, just an ordinary day that turned catastrophic in seconds. Richard had been 13, caught in that awkward space between childhood and adolescence, and suddenly without the father who had been his hero, his compass. I pulled out the will James had updated just months before his death, as if some premonition had guided him. In clear language, he had left everything to me, including full ownership of the Oakmont property, with a single stipulation: to be passed to our son Richard upon Eleanor's death, or at her discretion when she deems him ready for such responsibility, when she deems him ready. James had trusted my judgment, believing I would know when the time was right. For years after his death, that property had been our lifeline. The rental income had supplemented my teacher's salary, helping me provide for Richard through high school and then college. It had funded his study abroad program in Spain, his first car, the security deposit on his first apartment, all without him ever fully understanding the source of our financial stability. Not that I'd hidden it from him. Not exactly. When he was 18, I'd shown him his father's will, explained about the Oakmont property. But he'd been preoccupied with college applications and first relationships, barely skimming the documents before handing them back with a distracted, "That's great, Mom," before returning to his laptop. In the years that followed, between his studies and my grief, the conversation had simply never resumed in any meaningful way. I'd assumed, perhaps naively, that he remembered, that somewhere in his consciousness was the knowledge that the Mitchell house he and Vanessa coveted had deep roots in his own family history. But as I reread the emails I'd discovered, it became painfully clear that this crucial fact had been forgotten, or perhaps deliberately overlooked. Baxter lifted his head, sensing my distress, and patted over to rest his chin on my knee. I scratched, behind his ears absently, mind still traveling through the past. After college, Richard had changed. The boy who once accompanied me to weekly dinners with James's parents, who helped me plant flowers at his father's grave each spring, had been replaced by a young professional increasingly consumed by appearances and ambition. I could pinpoint the shift almost to the day, his first performance review at Meridian Consulting. He'd come home dejected, explaining that his supervisor had suggested he refine his personal brand if he wanted to advance. Within weeks, he'd traded his comfortable clothes for tailored suits, his genuine laugh for a measured chuckle, his weekend calls to me for networking events with colleagues. By the time he met Vanessa at a charity gala 3 years later, the transformation was complete. She had seemed like the perfect match for this new Richard, polished, ambitious, strategically charming. At their wedding, I'd watched my son slip his ring onto her finger and wondered if he remembered how we'd selected his father's wedding. Band together, Richard solemnly carrying the small velvet box to the altar at age 9 when I'd finally felt ready to remove it from my own hand. The wedding had been my first glimpse of what was to come. Seated at a table far from the bridal party, introduced briefly during Richard's speech as my mom Eleanor, I'd felt the ground shifting beneath me. But I'd silenced my concerns, telling myself it was natural for a young man to center his new wife on such a day. Then came the small exclusions, the broken plans, the gradually diminishing role I played in his life. Each time I raised a gentle question about it, Richard would assure me nothing had changed. "We're just busy, Mom. Everyone at my level works. These hours. Vanessa's firm is even worse." I flipped through the photos, watching Richard grow from a gap-toothed child to a serious teenager, to the impeccably groomed professional he'd become. In the earlier pictures, his eyes carried James's warmth, his smile open and genuine. In the most recent ones, the few I had from the past 3 years, something had hardened, a careful mask replacing the expressive face I'd known. The last photo in the album was from their housewarming 2 years ago. Richard and Vanessa stood in their new apartment, champagne flutes raised. I wasn't in the picture. I'd been the one taking it, at Vanessa's request. In the background, just visible, on their coffee table, was a real estate magazine open to a page featuring historic homes in Pinecrest Estates. Even then, they'd been planning, dreaming of the house that had been in our family all along. I closed the album and reached for my phone, scrolling to find the text messages from earlier that day. Martin had sent the property records I'd requested, along with a draft of the letter. I'd read it twice already, each time feeling a complex mix of sadness and resolve. "Are you sure about this approach?" Martin had asked when we spoke that afternoon. "There might be more diplomatic ways to handle the situation." "I'm sure," I'd replied, though my heart ached at the thought of what would follow. Sometimes clarity is the only kindness we can offer. Beside me, Baxter whined softly and nudged my hand with his nose, reminding me that life's simplest comforts, a dog's loyalty, a warm home, the solid truth of documented facts, were sometimes the most reliable. I returned the albums and papers to their box, keeping out only James's will and the original deed to the Oakmont property. Tomorrow, Richard and Vanessa would return from their trip, expecting to collect Baxter and continue with Operation Dream Home as if nothing had changed. They had no idea that their careful plans were built on a foundation of sand. or that I now held the power to wash that foundation away with a single conversation. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself standing before the mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. The woman who stared back wasn't the feeble, oblivious elderly seller Vanessa had described in her emails. I saw instead the lines earned through years of single parenthood, the quiet strength in my posture, the clear eyes of someone who had faced loss and emerged intact. "What would you do, James?" I whispered to the empty room, knowing no answer would come. But somehow, as I turned away from the mirror, I felt certain he would approve of the decision I'd made. After all, he'd been the one to give me the discretion to determine when, or if, Richard was ready for his inheritance. And right now, the son we'd raised seemed further from ready than ever before. New Year's Eve arrived with a light dusting of snow across Westlake Village. Baxter and I watched it fall from my apartment window, the flakes glowing orange in the streetlights below. My phone chirped with a text message from Richard. "Headed back tomorrow morning. We'll pick up Baxter around noon. Thanks. No, Happy New Year. No, hope you're well." Just a brief logistical update, as if I were a pet-sitting service rather than his mother. I didn't reply. The next morning, I woke early and took Baxter for one last walk, savoring his uncomplicated companionship. When we returned, I carefully gathered his belongings, placing his toys in the canvas bag Richard had sent along. I'd just finished when my doorbell rang, 11:30 a.m., 30 minutes earlier than expected. I opened the door to find not Richard, but Vanessa standing in the hallway, impeccably dressed, despite having just returned from vacation. "Eleanor?" she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you don't mind. Richard had a last-minute call with a client, so I offered to collect Baxter." I stepped aside to let her in, noting how she surveyed my modest apartment with barely concealed disdain. Baxter greeted her with considerably less enthusiasm than he'd shown me all week, staying closer to my side than hers. "How was your trip?" I asked, maintaining the polite fiction that we were simply family members engaged in normal conversation. "Productive," she replied cryptically, checking her designer watch. "We made some important decisions while we were away." Something in her tone made me pause. "Oh? What kind of decisions?" Vanessa's smile tightened further. "Actually, Eleanor, I'm glad we have this moment alone. Richard and I have been meaning to talk to you about our plans." She perched on the edge of my sofa, crossing her legs and resting her hands on her knee in a pose that seemed rehearsed for maximum authority. "We're accelerating our timeline for purchasing the Oakmont property. The Mitchells have indicated they're ready to sell, and we've secured the financing." I said nothing, letting the silence stretch between us. "We'll be making an offer next week," she continued, undeterred by my lack of response. "And Richard and I feel this would be an appropriate time to discuss some changes to our family dynamics." "Family dynamics," I repeated, the words hollow in my mouth. Vanessa nodded, her confidence growing with each word. "Richard has struggled with establishing appropriate boundaries with you. It's normal, of course. He's an only child, raised by a single mother. Those relationships can become entangled." My hands tightened around the cup of tea I'd been holding, but I kept my expression neutral. "Please continue. I'd love to hear your professional assessment of my relationship with my son." If she caught the sarcasm, she didn't acknowledge it. "We think it would be healthier for everyone if we created some space. Once we move to Pinecrest Estates, we'll be establishing new patterns. Monthly visits rather than weekly calls. Major holidays instead of casual drop-ins." "I see," I said quietly. "And Richard agrees with this assessment?" For the first time, Vanessa's confidence wavered slightly. "He understands it's necessary for our marriage to thrive. He's committed to our future together. A future that conveniently minimizes my presence," I observed. Vanessa's expression hardened. "Eleanor, this isn't personal. It's about creating healthy boundaries. Richard has spent his entire life trying to fill the void his father left. He's been carrying the emotional responsibility for your happiness since he was 13 years old. The casual cruelty of her words struck me like a physical blow. Is that what he told you? That he's been carrying me? Not in those exact words, she conceded. But it's obvious to anyone watching your interactions. The guilt he feels when he can't attend one of your dinners. The way he obsessively checks his phone when you call. She leaned forward. It's not healthy, Eleanor. For either of you. I set my teacup down carefully, afraid I might break it if I held on any longer. So your solution is to systematically remove me from his life, starting with family photos, moving on to holiday gatherings, and now formalizing it with monthly visits once you have your dream house? Vanessa sighed, the sound dripping with practiced patience. We're not removing you. We're establishing boundaries that allow Richard to be a husband first, a son second. Surely you want him to have a successful marriage? Of course I do, I replied. I've only ever wanted Richard's happiness. But I wasn't aware those two roles, husband and son, were mutually exclusive. They're not, when managed properly. Vanessa stood, smoothing her skirt. Which is what we're trying to do. I thought you'd appreciate hearing this directly from me, woman to woman, rather than putting Richard in the middle. How considerate of you, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. She picked up Baxter's leash, ignoring the way he backed away from her. The Mitchells mentioned you've been their landlord for years. They speak quite highly of you. Her tone suggested this was surprising. I hope when they approach you for a reference for the new owners, you'll have only positive things to say. The calculated presumption of her statement, the assumption that I would simply fall in line with their plans, finally broke through my composed exterior. Vanessa, I said slowly, rising to my feet. Before you continue making plans for a house, you don't own. There's something you should know. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh? I walked to my desk and removed the folder containing James's will and the property deed. The Mitchells don't own 47 Oakmont Drive. They never have. I held up the documents. I do. I've owned it since before Richard was born. The color drained from Vanessa's carefully made-up face. What are you talking about? The house belonged to James's grandfather. It was given to us as a wedding gift. We rented it out because we preferred living elsewhere, but it has always remained in our family. Vanessa stared at the papers in my hand, her carefully constructed reality visibly crumbling. But the Mitchells, they said they were selling. They are moving out, I confirmed. Their lease expires next month. They've been my tenants for 7 years. You can't be serious, she whispered, the implications dawning on her. All this time, I echoed. While you and Richard were scheming to secure your dream home and simultaneously push me to the margins of your lives, that home has been part of Richard's inheritance. An inheritance I've been managing for his benefit since his father died. Vanessa reached for the documents with trembling hands. Let me see those. I stepped back, keeping the folder close. I don't think so. You'll have plenty of time to review everything with your lawyer, if that's the route you choose to take. Does Richard know about this? She demanded, anger replacing shock. He did. Once, I showed him the will when he turned 18, but it seems he's forgotten, or chosen to forget. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing. Just as he's chosen to forget many things about our family since you entered his life. Vanessa's jaw tightened. This changes nothing about the boundaries we're establishing. On the contrary, I replied, it changes everything about your leverage in this situation. I gathered Baxter's leash from her now limp hand and guided the grateful dog back to my side. I think you should leave now, Vanessa. Tell Richard that Baxter seems a bit under the weather, so I'll keep him another day. And tell him... I paused, choosing my words carefully. Tell him his mother would like to speak with him. Alone. For a moment, Vanessa seemed ready to argue, but something in my expression must have warned her against it. She snatched up her purse, her movements jerky with suppressed rage. "This isn't over," she said as she reached the door. "Richard and I are building a life together, Eleanor. A property dispute won't change that." I smiled sadly. "This isn't about property, Vanessa." It never was. After she left, I sank onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted. Baxter jumped up beside me, resting his head on my lap as if offering comfort. I stroked his soft fur, replaying the conversation in my mind. For 3 years, I'd watched my relationship with Richard deteriorate, making excuses for his behavior, blaming myself for being too needy, too present, too much. I'd reduced myself to make room for the life he was building with Vanessa, accepting scraps of his attention with pathetic gratitude. But now, for the first time, I saw the situation with painful clarity. This wasn't about natural boundaries between a married couple and extended family. This was about Vanessa systematically isolating Richard from anyone who had a claim on his affection or loyalty aside from her. And Richard, whether from guilt, misplaced loyalty, or simple weakness, had allowed it to happen. My phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. "Vanessa said Baxter is sick? What's going on? Also, she mentioned something about the Oakmont property?" I set the phone aside without responding. This conversation wouldn't happen by text message or with Vanessa whispering in his ear. If Richard wanted answers, he would need to face me directly. Not as the dutiful son making an obligatory monthly visit, but as the grown man he claimed to be, ready to hear uncomfortable truths about himself and the woman he'd married. The snow continued to fall outside my window, covering the world in clean, forgiving white. But inside, something had hardened in my heart, a resolve that felt both unfamiliar and long overdue. Richard arrived at my apartment the following morning, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. I watched him from my window as he paced back and forth in the parking lot before finally approaching the building, his shoulders hunched against both the January chill and the conversation ahead. When he knocked, the sound was hesitant, 3 soft taps rather than his usual confident rhythm. Baxter barked once in recognition, tail wagging despite the tension hanging in the air. I took a deep breath, straightened my sweater, and opened the door. "Mom," Richard said, his voice carefully neutral. His eyes moved past me to scan the apartment, as if expecting to find someone else there. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without a word. He entered slowly, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, a habit from his teenage years when that same bowl had sat on our entryway table in the house we'd shared after James died. The unconscious familiarity of the gesture struck me, a painful reminder of the son I'd once known so well. "Vanessa told me some confusing things yesterday," he began, hovering awkwardly by the sofa instead of sitting down. "Something about you owning the Oakmont property? That can't be right." I retrieved the folder I'd prepared and handed it to him. "See for yourself." Richard flipped it open, his forehead creasing as he scanned the documents inside. I watched recognition dawn on his face, followed quickly by disbelief. This is Dad's will," he murmured, flipping to the next page. "And the deed to 47 Oakmont. In your name." "Yes." He looked up, confusion giving way to something harder. "Why didn't you tell me?" "All this time, Vanessa and I have been saving, meeting with mortgage brokers, driving past that house nearly every weekend, imagining our future there." "I did tell you," I replied calmly. "When you turned 18, I showed you these exact documents, explained that the house was part of your father's legacy, managed by me until the time was right." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that my heart squeezed painfully in my chest. I don't remember that." "Apparently not." Just as you don't seem to remember a lot of things these days, Richard. His jaw tightened. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've watched you change over the past 3 years. I've been excluded from family photos, relegated to the outer edges of your life, treated like an inconvenient acquaintance rather than your mother. My voice remained steady, though my hands trembled slightly. And I've said nothing, convinced myself it was normal, that I was being oversensitive. Richard's expression shifted between guilt and defensiveness. Mom, you're exaggerating. We've just been busy building our lives. No, I cut him off, the word sharper than I'd intended. No more excuses, Richard. I found the emails. He froze. What emails? The ones about Operation Dream House. The ones where Vanessa discussed using my fixed income against me to negotiate a below-market price. The ones where she and her mother planned how to create distance once you secured the house. The color drained from his face. Those were private. Yes, they were. Private plans to manipulate me, to push me further from your life while using my financial situation against me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? That I would just accept being treated like an obligation rather than family? Richard sank onto the sofa, Baxter immediately jumping up beside him and resting his head on his knee. For a moment, he looked like the boy I remembered, vulnerable, uncertain, seeking comfort. It wasn't supposed to be like that, he said finally, his voice hollow. Vanessa just thought we needed clearer boundaries. She said it was healthier for everyone. Boundaries, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Is that what you call it when your wife orchestrates a systematic campaign to isolate you from your only living parent? When she drafts emails about manipulating an elderly woman for financial gain? When she makes unilateral decisions about your family relationships? Richard's head snapped up. That's not fair. Vanessa has been supportive of my career, of our future together. She's organized, efficient. She's controlling, I interrupted gently. She's methodically removed anyone who might have a claim on your attention or affection aside from her. And you've let her do it. He stood abruptly, pacing across the small living room. You just don't understand her. Vanessa comes from a different world. Her family has expectations. I understand her perfectly well, Richard. Better than you do, I think. I sat in the armchair across from him, maintaining eye contact despite his obvious discomfort. What I don't understand is you. When did my son, the boy who stood up to bullies on the playground, who brought flowers to Mrs. Abernathy when her husband died, who held my hand at his father's funeral and promised we'd always take care of each other. When did that boy become someone who would participate in schemes to manipulate his own mother? His face crumpled. I never meant. Maybe not consciously, I acknowledged. But you've been complicit, Richard. Every time you let Vanessa exclude me, every time you canceled our plans without explanation, every time you stood silently while she referred to me as Eleanor instead of your mother, you made a choice. He collapsed back onto the sofa, head in his hands. I don't know what happened, he whispered. Everything changed so fast after the wedding. Vanessa had all these ideas about our social circle, our future. She said I needed to focus on my career, on networking with the right people. That family obligations could hold me back. And you believed her? Richard didn't answer immediately. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. I didn't want to disappoint her. Her family is so different from ours. They have connections, money, influence. When I'm with them, I feel like I'm part of something bigger, something important. More important than the family that raised you, than the mother who worked 2 jobs to put you through college. The words slipped out before I could stop them, heavy with years of unacknowledged hurt. He flinched. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, Richard? Help me understand how my son became someone who would let his wife call our relationship entangled. Who would participate in a plan called Operation Dreamhouse, aimed at securing property you didn't realize was already in your family? Silence stretched between us, broken only by Baxter's soft whines as he sensed the tension in the room. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, the day already beginning to fade, though it was barely afternoon. "I don't know what to say," Richard finally admitted, his voice small. "When you put it like that." "It sounds awful," I finished for him. "Because it is." He nodded slowly, the full weight of his actions finally seeming to register. "What are you going to do about the house?" The question hung in the air between us, laden with implications. What was I going to do? About the house? About our relationship? About the future Richard and Vanessa had planned at my expense? I'd spent sleepless nights considering exactly this question. I'd imagined various scenarios: selling the house to strangers just to spite them, gifting it to Richard with no strings attached, using it as leverage to secure my place in their lives. None had felt right. "I haven't decided yet," I answered, honestly. "But I do know this, Richard. I won't be manipulated or marginalized anymore, not even by my own son. I deserve better than that." His eyes widened slightly, as if he'd never considered that I might have expectations, boundaries of my own. "For 25 years, I've put you first," I continued. "After your father died, every decision I made was with your well-being in mind. I chose teaching positions based on school districts that would serve you best. I forwent relationships that might have complicated your life. I managed your father's estate to secure your future." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But I never expected gratitude, Richard. I just expected respect." "Mom, I do respect you," he protested weakly. "No," I said gently but firmly. "You don't. Not as a person with my own life, my own dignity. If you did, you never would have allowed what's happened these past 3 years." Richard stood again, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. For several minutes he said nothing, his breath fogging the glass in irregular patterns. "Do you hate her?" he finally asked, still facing away from me. "Vanessa, I mean." The question caught me off guard. "No," I replied after a moment's consideration. "I don't hate Vanessa. I don't even blame her entirely. She's simply acted according to her nature and her upbringing. My disappointment lies with you, Richard. You're the one who knows better, who was raised with different values." He turned, his expression pained. "What do you want me to do?" "That's not for me to decide," I said. "But I would suggest you start by examining who you've become and whether that person still reflects the values your father and I tried to instill in you." Richard ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. "And the house?" "The house will remain exactly where it's been for the past 40 years, in our family," I replied. "What happens with it depends on what happens next between us." He nodded slowly, accepting that this wasn't a negotiation but a reckoning, one that had been long overdue. "I should go," he said finally. "I need to think about everything you've said." I stood, walking him to the door. Baxter followed, pressing against Richard's legs as if reluctant to see him leave. "Richard," I said as he stepped into the hallway, "whatever you decide, remember this. Real love doesn't diminish you. It doesn't require you to cut off parts of yourself or your past. It expands you, makes room for all the complicated pieces that make you who you are." He paused, one hand on the doorframe. "Dad used to say something like that." "Yes," I replied softly. He did. After he left, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, Baxter's warm weight pressed against my side. For the first time in years, I felt a curious lightness spreading through me. Not happiness exactly, but the unmistakable sensation of having finally set down a burden I'd carried for far too long. The future remained uncertain, but one thing had become crystal clear. I would never again make myself small to accommodate those who couldn't see my worth. 3 days passed without a word. From Richard. I kept my phone nearby, checking it more often than I cared to admit, but no calls or messages appeared. The silence wasn't entirely unexpected. Richard had always needed time to process difficult conversations, even as a child. But it weighed on me nonetheless. On the 4th day, Martin called with an update about the Oakmont property. "The Mitchells have confirmed they'll be vacating by the 15th, he reported. "They've asked if you'll need access before then to assess any repairs or updates." I glanced around my small apartment, considering the question. In all the years I'd owned the Oakmont house, I'd rarely visited it. James had handled the property management when he was alive, and after his death, I'd relied on a local agency to deal with tenant relations and maintenance. The house existed in my mind more as a financial asset than a physical space, a source of income and security, but not a home. Yes, I decided, I think I should see it before making any further decisions. "Shall I arrange a time with them?" Martin asked. "Perhaps next week?" "No," I replied, a sense of urgency suddenly taking hold. "Today, if possible. This afternoon." 2. Hours later, I pulled into the circular driveway of 47 Oakmont Drive, the grand colonial looking exactly as it had in the photos Richard and Vanessa had so covetously shown around during holiday gatherings. The red brick exterior, white columns flanking the entrance, expansive front lawn covered in a pristine blanket of snow. It was undeniably impressive, the quintessential dream home that had become the centerpiece of their ambitions. Janet Mitchell greeted me at the door, her welcoming smile tinged with surprise. "Mrs. Calloway, what a pleasure to finally meet you in person after all these years." "Please, call me Eleanor," I said, accepting her handshake. "Thank you for accommodating my visit on such short notice." "Of course, we've always been grateful for how understanding you've been as a landlord." She ushered me inside, where the high-ceilinged foyer opened into a spacious living area. "Robert's at work, but he'll be sorry he missed you. He always says we won the rental lottery with you." I smiled, taking in the elegant space. The Mitchells had furnished it beautifully, with comfortable sofas and tasteful artwork that complemented the home's classic architecture. Through wide windows, I could see the backyard stretching toward a small wooded area, offering both openness and privacy. "It's strange," Janet continued, leading me through to the kitchen. "We've spoken on the phone so many times, but this is the first time you've visited while we've lived here." "I've always believed in giving tenants their space," I explained. "Besides, you've never given me any reason to worry about the property." Janet laughed lightly. "We've loved it too much to cause any damage. I admit, we considered trying to buy it from you more than once over the years, but we always assumed it held special significance for your family." I nodded, running my fingers along the smooth granite countertop. "It does. My late husband's grandfather built it in the 1940s. It's been in the family ever since. That explains why you never sold, even when property values in Pinecrest skyrocketed." Janet hesitated, her expression growing curious. "Though I was a bit surprised to hear from the agency that you might be selling now. Your daughter-in-law mentioned you were considering their offer?" I stiffened slightly. "My daughter-in-law spoke to you about this." Janet's cheeks flushed. "Oh, I hope I haven't overstepped. She and your son stopped by about a month ago. Lovely couple. She mentioned they were interested in purchasing the property and that you were amenable to the idea. She asked quite a few questions about the house, the neighborhood." Of course she had. Vanessa would have wanted to know every detail before making her move. I could easily imagine her charming the Mitchells, presenting herself and Richard as the perfect next occupants for the home they'd cherished. "Would you mind showing me the rest of the house?" I asked, deliberately changing the subject. I'd love to see what you've done with it. Janet gave me a full tour, from the formal dining room to the 4 upstairs bedrooms, each thoughtfully decorated and maintained. The master suite featured a sitting area with windows overlooking the backyard, and a renovated bathroom with a soaking tub I could easily imagine enjoying after a long day. We updated the bathroom 5 years ago, with your permission, Janet explained. And the kitchen appliances are all less than 3 years old. I nodded, making mental notes as we moved through the house. It was larger than any home I'd ever lived in, certainly more space than I needed as a single woman. Yet as we wandered from room to room, something unexpected began to stir within me. A sense of possibility, of potential futures I hadn't previously considered. And this is the sunroom, Janet said, opening French doors to reveal a charming space with windows on 3 sides. My favorite spot in the whole house, perfect for morning coffee or afternoon reading. I stepped inside, immediately, drawn to the peaceful atmosphere. Winter sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the space despite the snow visible outside. A comfortable reading chair sat in one corner, beside a small table stacked with books. I can see why you love it, I murmured, imagining myself. In that chair, Baxter curled at my feet, a novel open in my lap. Janet smiled. It's going to be the hardest room to leave behind, but Robert's new position in Seattle is too good an opportunity to pass up. After completing the tour, we returned to the kitchen, where Janet offered tea. As she filled the kettle, a question that had been forming throughout the visit finally crystallized in my mind. Janet, I began carefully, if I decided not to sell the house, would you and Robert consider extending your lease? Perhaps for another year? She turned, surprise evident on her face. Oh, well, we couldn't. Robert's position starts in February. That's why we're leaving mid-month. She paused, studying my expression. If you don't mind my asking, I thought the plan was for your son and his wife to purchase the property? There is no plan exactly, I replied. I'm considering my options. Janet nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. I see. Well, in that case, would you like me to put you in touch with our contractor? If you're planning renovations before selling or leasing to someone new, he's absolutely wonderful. Did all our bathroom work? Thank you. That would be helpful, I said, accepting the cup of tea she offered. But I'm not necessarily thinking of leasing to someone new. Oh? Janet's curiosity was palpable. I sipped my tea, the idea that had been forming throughout the tour now fully taking shape. I might move in myself. The words, once spoken, seemed to hang in the air between us, both surprising and inevitable. Janet's eyebrows rose slightly, but her smile was warm. It's a wonderful home to live in, she said simply. We've been very happy here. After finishing our tea and exchanging contact information for the contractor, I thanked Janet for her hospitality and headed back to my car. Instead of leaving immediately, I sat in the driveway for several minutes, gazing at the house, my house, with new eyes. For 20 years, 47 Oakmont Drive had represented James's legacy, a financial asset to secure Richard's future, and most recently, the centerpiece of Vanessa's ambitious plans. But it had never been my home. I had never considered that it could be, that I might claim this piece of family heritage for myself, rather than holding it in trust for others. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. My apartment in Westlake Village was comfortable, familiar, manageable for a woman living alone. This house was grand, perhaps even intimidating in its size and history. Yet sitting in its sunroom, I had felt a rightness, a sense of belonging I hadn't experienced in years. As I finally drove away, my mind raced with possibilities. The practical considerations were significant: furniture, moving logistics, ongoing maintenance of a property that size. But beyond those details lay something more profound: the symbolic power of reclaiming the house as my own, of transforming it from an inheritance withheld to a life embraced. Back at my apartment, I called Martin to share my emerging plan. "I'm considering moving into the Oakmont house myself," I told him, still half surprised by my own decision. "At least temporarily, while I decide what to do long term." "That's unexpected," Martin replied after a brief pause. "What about Richard and Vanessa?" "They seemed quite set on purchasing it." "They were set on purchasing a house they believed belonged to strangers," I pointed out. "The reality is quite different. Besides, I haven't heard from Richard since our conversation 4 days ago." "Give him time, Eleanor," Martin advised gently. "This is a significant adjustment to his understanding of both the property and your relationship." "I know," I sighed, scratching Baxter's ears as he rested his head on my lap. "But I can't put my life on hold waiting for Richard to sort through his feelings. The Mitchells are leaving in less than 2 weeks. If I'm going to do this, I need to start preparing now." "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this move?" Martin asked, his tone careful. It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself throughout the drive home. Was I being petty, claiming the house just to spite Richard and Vanessa? Was I trying to force a confrontation, to make my son face the consequences of his choices? Or was there something more authentic driving this decision? "I'm reclaiming something of myself," I said finally. "For 20 years, I've defined my life around Richard's needs, preserved this house for his future. Meanwhile, I've been living in this apartment that's never really felt like home, waiting for what? Permission to prioritize my own happiness?" Martin was silent for a moment. "You don't need anyone's permission for that, Eleanor." "No," I agreed. "I don't. That's precisely the point." After we hung up, I spent the evening making lists: what to keep, what to donate, what I would need to purchase for the larger space. I researched moving companies, contacted the Mitchells' contractor about minor updates I wanted to make before moving in, and even browsed furniture websites for pieces that might suit the sunroom. With each step, the plan became more concrete, more real. I felt a growing sense of purpose, of agency over my own life, that had been missing for far too long. This house, this decision, represented more than just a change of address. It was a declaration of independence, a statement that I was more than just Richard's mother or James's widow. I was Eleanor Calloway, finally ready to build a life that centered my own needs and desires. As I prepared for bed that night, my phone finally chimed with a text message from Richard. "Mom, we need to talk. Can I come by tomorrow evening? Alone." I stared at the message for several moments, a complex wave of emotions washing over me. Relief that he'd finally reached out, apprehension about the conversation to come, and a new steely resolve that hadn't been present during our last encounter. "Yes," I typed back. 7 would work. I hesitated, then added, "I have some news to share as well. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But for tonight, I fell asleep with a sense of certainty I hadn't felt in years. Baxter snoring softly beside me, and dreams of sunlit mornings in a room filled with windows. At precisely 7:02 p.m., Richard knocked on my apartment door. I opened, it to find him standing there alone as promised, his expression guarded but determined. He'd come directly from work, still wearing his tailored charcoal suit, though he'd loosened his tie, a small gesture toward informality that reminded me of James. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. Baxter greeted him with enthusiastic jumps, tail wagging frantically. "Hey, buddy," Richard murmured, bending to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I've missed you too." I gestured toward the living room, where I'd set out a pot of coffee and 2 mugs. "Would you like some? Or I can make tea if you prefer." "Coffee's fine," he replied, settling onto the sofa. His eyes took in the stacks of moving boxes I'd started to assemble in the corner, the packing tape and markers laid out on the coffee table. Are you going somewhere? I poured us each a cup before answering. Yes, that's part of what I wanted to discuss with you tonight. A flash of alarm crossed his face. You're not moving away, are you? To another state or something? The question surprised me, the immediate leap to concern that I might be leaving altogether. No, nothing like that. But before we get to that, you said you wanted to talk? Richard nodded, wrapping his hands around the mug as if drawing strength from its warmth. I've been thinking about everything you said the other day. About Vanessa. About how things have changed between us. He paused, taking a deep breath. You were right about all of it. I remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. After I left here, I went home and pulled out our old photo albums, the ones from before Dad died, from high school, college. I wanted to remember who I used to be. He shook his head ruefully. It was like looking at a different person, someone more authentic. What do you mean? I asked quietly. I mean, I hardly recognized myself in those pictures. The way I smiled, the clothes I wore, the friends I surrounded myself with. It was all so different from who I've become. He set down his coffee, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. When did I start caring so much about appearances? About impressing people who don't actually care about me? It was a rhetorical question, but I answered anyway. Around the time of your first performance review at Meridian, when your supervisor suggested you needed to refine your personal brand. Richard looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. You remember that? Of course I remember. You came home that day looking like someone had punched you in the gut. Within a month, you'd replaced your entire wardrobe, changed your haircut, even the way you spoke. I smiled sadly. Mothers notice. These things, Richard. He ran a hand through his hair. The same nervous gesture he'd had since childhood. I just wanted to succeed, to make something of myself. You already were something, I reminded him gently. Someone your father would have been proud of. Richard's eyes glistened briefly before he blinked back the emotion. The thing is, Mom, after our talk, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about real love making room for all the complicated pieces that make you who you are. And I realized that's exactly what's been missing in my relationship with Vanessa. He stood abruptly, moving to the window to gaze out at the parking lot below. She's never been interested in who I was before we met. When I try to share stories about Dad, about growing up, about you, she changes the subject, says we need to focus on our future, not my past. And you let her, I observed, not unkindly. I did, he agreed, turning back to face me. Because it was easier than fighting. Because I thought maybe she was right. That moving forward meant leaving the past behind. The past isn't just something to discard, Richard. It's the foundation that shapes who we are. He nodded slowly. I know that now. Or maybe I always knew it, but I convinced myself otherwise. He returned to the sofa, his posture more relaxed than when he'd arrived. I confronted Vanessa about the emails you found, about Operation Dream, House and her plans to distance me from you. My stomach tightened. How did that go? Not well, he admitted with a grimace. At first she tried to deny it, said you were misinterpreting things. When I pressed harder, she got defensive, said she was only looking out for our interests as a couple. That's when I realized. Realized what? That our interests as a couple always seem to align perfectly with what Vanessa wants, he said, simply. And that somewhere along the way I stopped having opinions of my own. I took a sip of coffee, processing his words. This wasn't the conversation I'd been expecting. I'd prepared myself for excuses, for attempts to minimize what had happened, perhaps even for Richard to try to negotiate about the house on Vanessa's behalf. Instead, he seemed to be experiencing a genuine moment of self-reflection. So what? Happens now? I asked carefully. Richard exhaled slowly. I don't know exactly. I've been staying at Mark's place for the past couple of days, my colleague from work. I needed some space to think. He looked at me directly. But I do know that I owe you an apology, Mom. A real one. I've been a terrible son these past few years, allowing Vanessa to dictate my relationship with you, forgetting everything you've done for me. Richard, no, please let me finish. This is important. He reached across the coffee table to take my hand. I am so sorry for how I've treated you, for letting you be excluded from family photos, for canceling our plans, for sitting silently while Vanessa called you Eleanor instead of Mom or Mother, for forgetting that the house we've been coveting was already part of our family history. There's no excuse for any of it. The earnestness in his voice, the genuine remorse in his eyes, reminded me so much of the boy he'd once been, the one who'd come to me in tears after breaking a neighbor's window with an errant baseball, insisting on using his allowance to pay for the repair. Thank you, I said softly. That means a great deal to me. He squeezed my hand before releasing it. It's only the beginning of making things right. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want you to know I'm committed to rebuilding our relationship and to figuring out who I really, apart from Vanessa's expectations. Does that mean I let the question hang between us? I don't know if our marriage can survive this, Richard admitted, his voice faltering slightly. Once I started questioning the situation with you, I began seeing other patterns too. The way she's isolated me from my college friends, how she dismisses my career goals if they don't align with her vision for our future. He shook his head. We're going to try counseling, but honestly, I'm not optimistic. I nodded, careful to keep my expression neutral. Whatever issues existed in Richard's marriage, I knew better than to appear too eager for its dissolution. I think counseling is wise. Either way, you deserve a relationship built on mutual respect. Yeah, he agreed softly. I'm finally starting to believe that. He gestured toward the moving boxes in the corner. So, what's all this about? You mentioned you're moving? The moment had come, the revelation I'd been both anticipating and dreading. I took a steadying breath. I've decided to move into the Oakmont house myself, I said, watching his face carefully. The Mitchells are vacating on the 15th. I visited yesterday, and it feels right. Richard's expression cycled through several emotions rapidly: surprise, confusion, and something that looked briefly like disappointment before settling into cautious acceptance. You're going to live there? In Pinecrest Estates? I nodded. It's time I stopped treating that house as just an investment property, as something I was holding in trust for your future. For 20 years, I've managed it as part of your inheritance, never considering that I might claim it for myself. Wow, he said softly. That's unexpected. Is it? I challenged gently. Or is it just that you've never thought of me as someone with my own dreams, my own future to consider? He had the grace to look chagrined. You're right. I never thought about it that way. He paused, considering. So, this means it's not for sale? Not at the moment, no. I held his gaze steadily. I understand that might be disappointing to you and Vanessa, given your plans. To my surprise, Richard laughed, a short, slightly bitter sound. Mom, I think Operation Dreamhouse is the least of our concerns right now. Besides, he added, his expression softening, the house should go to someone who will appreciate its history, its connection to Dad and his family. I can't think of anyone more deserving than you. The simple generosity of his statement warmed, something that had been cold within me for a long time. Thank you, Richard. That means more than you know. He glanced around the apartment, the modest space I'd occupied since he left for college, large enough for one person but never particularly remarkable. This place never really suited you, did it? It served its purpose, I replied. It was affordable, convenient to the school where I taught. But no, it never felt quite like home. And you think Oakmont will? I considered the question, remembering the feeling that had washed over me in the sunroom, the sense of possibility that had followed me home. I think it has the potential to. It's a beautiful house with good bones, as your father would have said. The right furniture, some personal touches. It could become something special. Richard nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. You're really doing this, claiming your own life. Yes, I confirmed. It's about time. Don't. You think? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a genuine one, reminiscent of the boy in those old photo albums. Actually, I think it's perfect timing. We spent the next hour discussing practical matters, the logistics of my move, the renovations I was considering, even the furniture I'd need to purchase. Richard offered to help with the heavy lifting, suggesting we rent a truck rather than hiring expensive movers. I could come over next weekend, he proposed. Bring Mark and a couple other guys from work. We could knock it out in a day. That would be wonderful, I said, touched by the offer. Are you sure Vanessa wouldn't mind? His expression hardened slightly. I'm not asking her permission, Mom. That's part of the problem I'm trying to fix. As the evening wound down, Richard stood to leave, gathering his coat from the hook by the door. Baxter followed, circling his legs as if reluctant to see him go. You know, Richard said, pausing with his hand on the doorknob, Dad would be proud of you. For standing up for yourself. For embracing your future instead of just preserving mine. A lump formed in my throat at the unexpected invocation of James. I hope so. I know so, Richard insisted. He always said you were the strongest person he'd ever met, even if you didn't see it in yourself. After he left, I stood in the doorway, for a long moment, considering the unexpected turn the evening had taken. When Richard had texted about coming over, I'd braced myself for conflict, for difficult negotiations. Instead, I'd glimpsed something I'd feared was lost forever. My son, the real Richard, emerging from beneath the polished facade he'd constructed. Whether his marriage survived or not, whether our relationship fully healed or remained complicated, one thing had become clear. The strategic reversal I'd initiated by claiming the Oakmont house for myself had accomplished something I hadn't dared to hope for. It had created space for authentic change, not just in my circumstances, but perhaps in Richard's as well. As I turned back to the half-packed boxes and lists of furniture measurements scattered across my living room, I felt lighter than I had in years. The path ahead might not be entirely smooth, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt truly mine. The 2 weeks leading up to my move passed in a whirlwind of activity. Each day brought new decisions. Which furniture to keep, which to donate, what color to paint the sunroom, which moving company to hire for the larger pieces I couldn't part with. I found myself energized by these choices in a way I hadn't anticipated, each one an affirmation of my new direction. True to his word, Richard appeared that Saturday morning with 3 colleagues and a rented moving truck. The men worked efficiently, carrying boxes and furniture while I directed traffic, deciding what went where. By mid-afternoon, my apartment was nearly empty, most of my possessions already transported to Oakmont Drive. That should do it for this load, Richard announced, closing the truck's rear door. We'll head over to the house and start unloading. You coming with us or taking your car? I'll follow in my car, I replied. I need to stop and pick up Baxter from the groomer on the way. Richard nodded, then hesitated. Mom, before we go, there's something I should mention. His expression grew serious. Vanessa knows about today, about us moving you into the Oakmont house. My stomach tightened. How did she take it? About as well as you'd expect, he said with a grimace. She's been alternating between cold silence and angry outbursts since I told her. Last night, she said if I went through with helping you move, I shouldn't bother coming home afterward. Oh, Richard. I sighed, recognizing the manipulation tactic for what it was. I don't want to cause problems in your marriage. He shook his head firmly. You're not causing anything, Mom. This is between Vanessa and me. Her ultimatum just confirms what I've been realizing these past couple of weeks, that her idea of marriage is about control, not partnership. He managed, a wry smile. Besides, I've still got Mark's couch if I need it. I studied his face, searching for signs of the uncertainty or resentment I might have expected. Instead, I saw only resolve, tinged perhaps with sadness, but no regret. All right, I said finally. I'll see you at the house. An hour later, I pulled into the circular driveway of 47 Oakmont Drive, Baxter freshly groomed and excited in the passenger seat. The moving truck was already there, Richard and his friends carrying boxes inside. For a moment, I simply sat in the car, taking in the sight of the colonial house, my house, with its grand entrance and mature oak trees flanking the driveway. Ready, Baxter? I asked, scratching behind his ears. This is home now. We walked up the front path together, Baxter sniffing excitedly at the unfamiliar territory. Inside, the house was a pleasant chaos of half-unpacked boxes and furniture awaiting proper placement. Richard had already set up my bed in the master bedroom and was working on assembling a bookshelf in what would become my study. What do you think? He called as I entered. Starting to feel like home yet? Getting there, I replied, watching, as Baxter explored the hallway, tail wagging with each new discovery. It will take some time. By early evening, the essentials were in place. Richard's friends had departed, leaving just the two of us to arrange the last few items and order pizza for a makeshift dinner. We sat on the floor of the sunroom, paper plates balanced on our laps, surrounded by cardboard boxes. It's going to be beautiful in here once you're fully settled, Richard observed, looking around the space bathed in the golden light of sunset. I can already picture you reading in that corner with Baxter at your feet. I smiled, following his gaze. That's exactly what I was thinking when I toured the house. The contractor did a nice job with the paint, he added, gesturing to the soft sage color that now covered the walls, a project I'd commissioned immediately after deciding to move in. It brings out the natural light. As we ate, Richard shared stories about his week, the tentative steps he'd taken to reconnect with old friends, his realization that he'd been dressing to impress others rather than for his own comfort or preferences. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones. Evidence of a man reclaiming himself piece by piece. I have my first counseling session on Tuesday, he mentioned, folding his empty paper plate. On my own, not with Vanessa. She refused to participate. I'm proud of you for going anyway, I told him. It takes courage to look at yourself honestly, to question the patterns you've fallen into. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately. About the kind of man he was, the kind of marriage you two had. It was different, wasn't it? From what Vanessa and I have? Very different, I confirmed. Your father and I had our disagreements, of course. No marriage is perfect. But we respected each other's independence, supported each other's growth. I paused, searching for the right words. We were partners, Richard. Equal participants in building a life together. That's what I want, he said simply. Whether it's with Vanessa or someone else eventually. I want what you and Dad had. The admission hung in the air between us, weighty with its implications. Before I could respond, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at it, his expression immediately clouding. Vanessa? I guessed. He nodded, turning the phone so I could see the message. Either you come home right now or don't bother coming back at all. Your choice. What are you going to do? I asked carefully, determined not to influence his decision. Richard stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it face down on the floor beside him. Finish helping my mother move into her new home, he said firmly. Vanessa's ultimatums aren't going to work anymore. We spent another hour unpacking kitchen essentials, arranging furniture in the living room, and making a list of items I'd need to purchase in the coming days. As the clock approached 10, Richard gathered his jacket, preparing to leave. "You're welcome to stay here tonight," I offered. "The guest room bed is already set up." He shook his head. "Thanks, but I told Mark I'd be back. Besides," he added with a small smile, "this is your first night in your new home. You and Baxter should have it to yourselves." I walked him to the door, suddenly overcome with a mix of emotions: gratitude for his help, pride in the man he was, becoming hope for our healing relationship, and beneath it all, a quiet sadness for the pain I knew lay ahead for him, regardless of how his marriage ultimately resolved. "Thank you for today," I said, giving him a quick hug. "It would have been much harder without you." "I'll stop by tomorrow to help with the rest," he promised. "Maybe bring breakfast?" "That would be lovely." After Richard left, I wandered through the quiet house, adjusting a picture frame here, straightening a lamp there, Baxter following at my heels. The space felt simultaneously strange and familiar, a paradox I couldn't quite resolve. Perhaps that was natural for a first night, I reasoned. It would take time for these rooms to absorb my presence, for my energy to replace the echoes of the Mitchells' life here. I was heading upstairs when the doorbell rang, startling me. Glancing at my watch, 10:32 p.m., I frowned, wondering if Richard had forgotten something. Baxter barked once, trotting toward the entrance. Through the decorative sidelight window, I could make out a woman's silhouette on the porch. My stomach dropped as recognition dawned. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. Vanessa stood on my doorstep, her normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled, eyes bright with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "Vanessa," I said evenly. "This is unexpected." "Is Richard here?" she demanded, trying to peer past me into the foyer. "No, he left about 20 minutes ago. He said he was staying at his colleague Mark's place tonight." Her jaw tightened. "Of course he did, running away rather than facing the consequences of his actions." "I think he's facing consequences quite directly," I countered, maintaining my composure. "Just not the ones you were hoping for." She laughed, a brittle sound that contained no humor. "You must be so pleased with yourself. Moving into our dream house, turning Richard against me." "I haven't turned Richard against anyone," I replied, calmly. "And this house was never yours to begin with. It's been in our family for generations. A fact you conveniently never mentioned," she snapped. "All those times we talked about wanting to buy this place, you just sat there silently, planning your little ambush. The same way you sat silently planning Operation Dream House?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "The scheme to manipulate an elderly seller because of her fixed income?" Vanessa had the grace to flush, though her posture remained defiant. "That was just talk. Strategizing. Everyone does it." "No, Vanessa. Not everyone schemes to take advantage of family members. Not everyone deliberately excludes their mother-in-law from holiday photos or family gatherings. Not everyone systematically works to isolate their spouse from loved ones." Her eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what Richard and I have together. The life we're building." "I know more than you think," I said softly. "I raised him. I know when he's truly happy, and when he's conforming to someone else's expectations. I know the difference between the genuine smile in those old photo albums and the careful one he wears now." For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across Vanessa's face, quickly replaced by renewed anger. "This isn't over, Eleanor. Richard may be confused right now, swayed by your guilt trips and manipulation, but he'll come back to me. He always does." The sad truth in her final statement struck me more than any of her accusations. Richard had indeed always returned to her orbit, compromising more and more of himself each time. Until now. "Maybe he will," I acknowledged, That's for him to decide. But it won't be the same Richard who left you this morning. He's remembering who he is, beneath all the layers you've imposed. Vanessa stepped back, her hand clutching her car keys so tightly her knuckles whitened. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. This house, Richard's temporary rebellion, none of it changes the fact that you're still a lonely old woman who raised a son too weak to stand up for himself. The words were designed to wound, to provoke an emotional response that would validate her narrative of me as the interfering, manipulative mother-in-law. Instead, I simply shook my head. "Good night, Vanessa," I said firmly, closing the door before she could launch another barb. Through the window, I watched her storm back to her car, slam the door, and drive away with more speed than was wise on the residential street. Only when her taillights had disappeared did I realize I was trembling slightly, the confrontation having taken more out of me than I'd wanted to admit. Baxter whined softly, pressing against my leg in canine concern. I knelt to stroke his fur, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "It's all right, boy," I murmured. "Just the first aftershock. There will be others." Later, as I lay in bed in the unfamiliar master bedroom, listening to the creaks and settling sounds of my new home, I reflected on the day's events. The move itself had gone more smoothly than I'd anticipated, but the human dynamics were proving more complicated. Richard's emerging independence, Vanessa's desperate attempts to reassert control, my own conflicted feelings about their marriage, all of it swirled together in a complex emotional tapestry. Yet, beneath the complexity, one simple truth remained. For the first time in decades, I had made a decision based solely on what I wanted, what I needed. Not as Richard's mother or James's widow, but as Eleanor Calloway, a woman with her own life to live. That truth, more than the grand house or the defeated daughter-in-law or even the healing relationship with my son, was the most significant consequence of all. Spring arrived at 47 Oakmont Drive with an explosion of color. The flowering dogwoods that lined the circular driveway burst into pink and white blooms, while daffodils and tulips emerged in cheerful clusters along the garden paths. From the sunroom, which had indeed become my favorite spot in the house, I could watch the gradual transformation of the backyard from winter's austerity to spring's abundance. 3 months had passed since my move, a period of adjustment and discovery. The house had slowly absorbed my presence. Rooms that once felt formal and imposing now warmed with personal touches, family photographs arranged on the mantel, my collection of novels filling the built-in bookshelves, colorful throw pillows softening the traditional furniture. Even Baxter had established his preferred spots, the patch of sunlight in the study during mornings, the cool tile of the kitchen floor in afternoons, and always the foot of my bed at night. On this particular Sunday morning in April, I sat in my reading chair by the sunroom windows, coffee cooling beside me, a half-finished novel open in my lap. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway drew my attention. I glanced at my watch. 11:15, right on time. Richard had established a pattern of Sunday brunches at my house in the weeks following my move. It had begun as a practical arrangement. He would help with the occasional odd job around the property while I would cook us a proper meal, but had evolved into something more meaningful, a weekly ritual that anchored our rebuilding relationship. Baxter raced to the door, barking his welcome as Richard's key turned in the lock. The sound of that key, a small piece of metal representing such enormous trust, still filled me with quiet joy each time I heard it. "Mom?" Richard called, letting himself in. "Something smells amazing." "In the kitchen," I replied, setting aside my book and making my way toward the entryway. "The quiche is just coming out of the oven." He appeared in the hallway, arms laden with grocery bags. Since February, he'd taken to bringing ingredients for the following week's meal, a gesture that spoke volumes about his commitment to our continued connection. "I brought those strawberries you like from the farmer's market," he said, setting the bags on the kitchen island. "And fresh herbs for the garden. The woman at the stand said it's the perfect time to plant basil and thyme." I smiled, accepting the kiss he planted on my cheek. Perfect. We can put them in this afternoon if you have time. Richard had changed in these past months, the transformation subtle but unmistakable. Gone were the stiff designer suits, replaced by comfortable jeans and casual shirts. His hair had grown slightly longer, more reminiscent of the style he'd worn in college. But the most significant change wasn't physical. It was in his eyes, in the way his smile reached them now, in the relaxed set of his shoulders. "How's the new project going?" I asked as we moved around the kitchen together, falling into the easy rhythm we'd established. Richard retrieving plates from the cabinet while I sliced fresh fruit, a synchronized dance that reminded me of cooking with James decades earlier. "Better than expected," he replied, arranging silverware on the table. "The Peterson account signed off on our proposal yesterday. Full creative control. Increased budget." He grinned, a flash of genuine pride lighting his features. My team's design was what sealed it. "Remember that concept I showed you last week? The one you suggested needed more warmth?" I nodded, remembering our conversation over coffee in this same kitchen. "Your suggestion made all the difference. We reworked the color palette, softened the edges like you said." He shook his head, amazement evident in his voice. 2 years at that firm, and this is the first time I've actually enjoyed the work. Felt proud of what we're creating. "Because you're finally bringing yourself to it," I observed, transferring the quiche to a serving plate. "Not just what you think others want to see." He considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think you're right. It's like, for years I was designing according to some external standard. What would impress the partners? What looked like other award-winning campaigns? Now I'm actually asking what moves me, what feels authentic." We carried the food to the dining room, the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows onto the antique table I'd inherited from James's parents decades ago. As we settled into our usual seats, a comfortable silence fell between us, the kind that exists only between people who no longer feel the need to fill every moment with words. "I filed the divorce papers yesterday," Richard said finally, his voice quiet but steady. I looked up from my plate, studying his expression. We'd discussed the possibility, of course. The counseling sessions he'd begun in January had quickly revealed the fundamental incompatibilities in his marriage: Vanessa's need for control, Richard's suppressed authentic self, patterns too deeply entrenched to easily unravel. "How are you feeling about that?" I asked carefully. He considered the question, fork suspended midair. "Sad," he admitted, "but also relieved. Like I can finally exhale after holding my breath for years." He set down his fork, meeting my gaze directly. "The counselor asked me something interesting last week. She said, if you removed all external pressure, what others expect, what looks good on paper, what you think you should want, what kind of life would you choose for yourself?" "That is an interesting question," I agreed. "What was your answer?" I didn't have one, not immediately. That's how deep this goes, Mom. I've spent so long conforming to external expectations that I couldn't even identify my own desires. A rueful smile crossed his lips, but I've been thinking about it ever since, and I'm starting to figure it out. It's like excavating my authentic self from beneath all these accumulated layers. I understood the process he described better than he knew. My own journey over these past months had involved similar excavation, rediscovering aspects of myself, long set aside during the years of single parenthood and practical survival. "How has Vanessa taken the news?" I asked, returning to the more immediate issue. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "About as well as you'd expect. Alternating between threatening me with financial ruin and promising to change everything I've objected to. Then, when neither approach worked, she tried to convince me you've manipulated me into destroying our marriage." "That seems to be her favorite theory," I noted dryly. "The irony is, if anyone was manipulating me, it was her. He shook his head, a mixture of regret and clarity in his expression. I just couldn't see it while I was in the middle of it. After we finished eating, Richard insisted on clearing the dishes while I prepared fresh coffee. We carried our mugs out to the backyard patio, settling into the Adirondack chairs I'd purchased shortly after moving in. "I've been thinking," Richard said, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the oak trees at the edge of the property, "about the house, about what happens next." My grip tightened slightly on my mug. "Oh?" "The divorce will mean liquidating assets, dividing property." He turned to face me. "Vanessa's lawyer has already made noise about including my inheritance expectations in the settlement calculations." "I see," I said, a chill of apprehension running through me despite the warm spring air. "And how do you feel about that?" Richard's expression softened into a smile. "I told them it was a non-starter. This house belongs to you now, Mom. Not as something you're holding in trust for me, but as your home. Your future." He reached over to cover my hand with his. "I've realized something important these past few months. Watching you claim this space, make it yours. Build a life here that centers your needs and happiness. It's taught me more than any counseling session could." "What has it taught you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "That it's never too late to reclaim yourself. That happiness doesn't come from acquiring the right possessions or impressing the right people. It comes from living authentically." He squeezed my hand gently. "Seeing you thrive here, watching you transform this house into a real home. It's been healing for me too." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at his words. "That means more than you know, Richard." As the afternoon progressed, we planted the herbs Richard had brought, installed a new bird feeder near the patio, and walked the property's perimeter with Baxter bounding ahead of us. The easy companionship between us felt both familiar and new, echoes of our relationship before Vanessa, but with an added dimension of mutual respect that had perhaps been missing even then. "Oh, before I forget," Richard said as we made our way back toward the house, "I ran into Leonard Graham at the coffee shop yesterday. He asked about you." I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, remembering the distinguished silver-haired man who had recently joined my book club, the retired investment banker whose intelligent observations and gentle humor had become a highlight of our monthly meetings. "Did he?" I replied, trying for nonchalance. Richard's knowing smile told me I hadn't succeeded. He mentioned the book club's discussion of the Dutch house was particularly lively thanks to your insights. He seemed quite impressed. "It's just a casual group," I demurred. "We meet at the library on the first Thursday of each month." "And yet Leonard has only started attending since you joined," Richard observed with exaggerated innocence. "Interesting coincidence." I swatted his arm lightly. "Don't start matchmaking, please. At my age, friendship is quite enough." "Who said anything about matchmaking? I'm just stating facts." His teasing tone faded into something more sincere. "But, for what it's worth, Mom, you deserve happiness in every form it might take, including companionship, if that's something you want." The simple acknowledgement that I might have desires and needs beyond my role as his mother touched me deeply. It represented the most profound shift in our relationship, a recognition of my full humanity that had perhaps been obscured during the years I'd devoted to raising him. As evening approached, Richard gathered his things, preparing to return to the apartment he'd rented after moving out of the home he'd shared with Vanessa. "Same time next week?" he asked, car keys in hand. "I'll be here," I promised, though I was thinking we might try that new restaurant in town for lunch instead. "My treat," he nodded, pleased by the suggestion. "I'd like that." After he left, I wandered through the quiet house, adjusting a pillow here, straightening a frame. There. The evening light cast a golden glow across the hardwood floors, warm and welcoming. Baxter padded alongside me, occasionally pressing his nose against my hand as if to remind me of his presence. In the study, once a formal space with heavy drapes and imposing furniture, now a cozy retreat with comfortable seating and well-stocked bookshelves. I paused before a photograph I'd recently framed. It showed Richard and me on moving day, both of us dusty and disheveled, sitting on the floor of the sunroom surrounded by boxes, laughing at something now forgotten. One of Richard's friends had snapped it without our knowledge, capturing a moment of genuine connection amid the chaos of transition. Beside it stood an older photograph, James holding 3-year-old Richard on his shoulders, both of them beaming with identical smiles. The continuity between these images, separated by decades yet linked by the thread of family love, filled me with a profound sense of rightness. My phone chimed with a text message. Expecting it to be Richard confirming his arrival home, I was surprised to see Leonard's name on the screen instead. Book recommendation based on our discussion Thursday. Have you read Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner? If not, I have an extra copy. Coffee sometime this week to discuss? I smiled, typing a response. Haven't read it. Coffee sounds lovely. Wednesday morning at Riverside Cafe? His reply came almost immediately. Perfect. 10:30. Looking forward to it. Setting the phone aside, I moved to the sunroom where I'd started my day. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of pink and gold, a fitting conclusion to a day of quiet contentment. Baxter settled at my feet with a contented sigh as I picked up my abandoned novel. This broader resolution, this peaceful inhabiting of my own life, had emerged so gradually I'd barely noticed its arrival. The house that had once represented James's legacy and Richard's inheritance had transformed into the backdrop for my own unfolding story. The son whose happiness had been my primary concern for decades was now finding his authentic path, supporting my journey as I had long supported his. And I, Eleanor Calloway, was finally the protagonist of my own life, rather than a supporting character in someone else's. As darkness fell, I closed my book, thinking not of the past or even tomorrow's tasks, but of the present moment, this house, this life, this sense of rightness that had been so long in coming. Whatever the future held, whether quiet solitude or new companionship, peaceful days or inevitable challenges, I would meet it not as Richard's mother or James's widow, but as myself. Wholly and authentically myself. 1 year from the day I moved into 47 Oakmont Drive, I decided to host a garden party. The backyard, once a pleasant but unremarkable stretch of lawn, had transformed under my attentive care into something approaching a sanctuary. Flowering perennials lined curved beds, a small vegetable garden flourished in the sunniest corner, and the patio I'd expanded now accommodated a teak dining set where 6 could comfortably gather. The weather cooperated beautifully, offering one of those perfect late January days that occasionally grace our region in winter. Mild temperatures, cloudless sky, the air carrying just enough crispness to feel invigorating rather than uncomfortable. Mom, where do you want this drink station? Richard called from the patio, where he was arranging tables covered in crisp white cloths. Under the oak tree, I replied, adjusting a vase of fresh-cut flowers from my garden. There's more shade there for the ice buckets. Richard nodded, moving efficiently to rearrange things according to my vision. In the year since his divorce had finalized, he'd settled into a new rhythm of life, a smaller apartment closer to his office, a promotion that recognized his renewed creativity and authentic leadership style, weekend hiking trips with friends he'd reconnected with after years of Vanessa-imposed distance. The changes in him had solidified, no longer tentative shifts, but permanent evolutions. He laughed more easily now, spoke more directly, dressed for comfort rather than impression. The Richard who helped me prepare for this gathering was far closer to the young man who had left for college full of ideals and enthusiasms than the polished, careful professional Vanessa had molded him into. Is Rebecca still coming? I asked, referring to the landscape architect he'd been dating for the past few months, a woman whose warm laugh and unpretentious manner had immediately endeared her to me. "She'll be here around 2, he confirmed. "She wanted to finish planting that community garden project first." The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of our first guests. Baxter, now moving a bit more slowly with age but no less enthusiastic, hurried to the front door, tail wagging in anticipation. "I'll get it," Richard offered, setting down the tray of glasses he'd been arranging. From the kitchen window, I watched as he greeted Leonard, who stood on the porch holding a bouquet of lilies and a bottle of wine. The two men shook hands warmly, their initial awkwardness long since transformed into genuine friendship. Leonard had become a fixture in my life over the past year, first as a book club acquaintance, then as a regular companion for concerts and museum exhibits, and finally, in recent months, as something more difficult to define but unmistakably precious. At 72, Leonard carried his years with grace, still tall and distinguished, his silver hair always neatly trimmed, his blue eyes retaining a youthful brightness that spoke of an engaged mind and curious spirit. Retired from his investment firm, he now divided his time between consulting for nonprofits, traveling to visit his grown children and grandchildren scattered across the country, and increasingly spending time with me. "Eleanor," he greeted, me entering the kitchen with his offerings. "These are from my garden. The lilies finally bloomed." I accepted both gifts with a smile. "They're beautiful, and just in time for the party." As I arranged the lilies in a crystal vase that had been James's mother's, Leonard moved comfortably around my kitchen, opening drawers with the familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time in this space. He located the wine opener without asking, gently shooed Baxter away from underfoot, and poured 2 glasses of the crisp white wine he'd brought. "To one remarkable year," he said, handing me a glass and raising his own in toast. "A year of transformation," I agreed, clinking my glass against his. More guests began to arrive. My former colleagues from the school where I'd taught for 20 years, members of the book club that now met in my sunroom once a month, Leonard's daughter and her husband who were visiting from Seattle, neighbors who had welcomed me warmly to Pinecrest Estates. The garden gradually filled with conversation and laughter, a diverse gathering united only by their connection to me. As I moved among my guests, refilling plates and ensuring everyone was comfortable, I caught glimpses of Richard engaged in animated conversation with Leonard's son-in-law about sustainable architecture, Rebecca showing photos of her latest garden project to my former principal, Leonard explaining the history of Oakmont's original construction to fascinated neighbors. These separate worlds, colliding and connecting in my backyard, created a tapestry of relationships I could never have imagined a year earlier. "This is quite a community you've built," observed Margaret, my closest friend from the teaching days, as we stood together watching the mingling guests. "When you left the apartment in Westlake Village, I worried you might feel isolated out. Here in Pinecrest," I smiled, recognizing the truth in her statement. I worried about that too. But it turns out creating a home isn't just about the physical space, it's about opening that space to connections, to possibilities. "Speaking of possibilities," Margaret said with a meaningful glance toward Leonard, who was now entertaining. A small group with a story that had them all laughing. "He seems wonderful." "He is," I acknowledged simply. Not in the ways I might have expected or looked for in my younger years, but in all the ways that matter now. The celebration continued into early evening, guests gradually departing with warm hugs and promises to return soon. As twilight descended, only the inner circle remained. Richard and Rebecca, Leonard and myself, gathered around the patio table with the remaining wine and plates of dessert. "I'd like to propose a toast," Richard said, raising his glass. "To Mom, who had the courage to reclaim her life and create all of this." He gestured to encompass the garden, the house glowing with warmth behind us, the gathered company. "You've taught me more this past year than in all the years before. What has she taught you?" Leonard asked, his expression genuinely curious. Richard considered the question, his gaze drifting toward the house that had once been the object of his and Vanessa's calculated ambitions, now transformed into something entirely different. That true happiness comes from authenticity, not acquisition, he said finally. That it's never too late to rewrite your story. That the most powerful act of love isn't sacrifice, it's example. His words hung in the gathering darkness, weighty, with truth that had been dearly purchased by all of us. Rebecca squeezed his hand, her expression reflecting both pride and understanding. To Eleanor, Leonard added, raising his glass to join Richard's toast, who reminds us that life's third act might well be its most authentic and fulfilling. After the final guest departed and Richard and Rebecca left with promises to return for Sunday brunch, Leonard helped me carry the last of the dishes inside. We worked in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of those who have found their natural rhythm together. Stay for coffee? I offered as we finished, not quite ready for the evening to end. I'd like that, he agreed, following me to the sunroom where the day had begun so many hours earlier. As I prepared the coffee in the kitchen, I could see him through the doorway, standing by the windows looking out at the garden now illuminated by the string lights Richard had installed. His posture, straight-backed yet relaxed, hands clasped loosely behind him, struck me with its quiet dignity, its unassuming presence. Here was a man comfortable in his own skin, carrying his years neither as a burden nor as a badge, but simply as accumulated experience that had shaped but not defined him. When I joined him with 2 steaming mugs, he turned with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes in a way I'd grown fond of. I was just thinking, he said as we settled into the comfortable chairs, about how differently this year might have unfolded. How so? If you hadn't found those emails, if you hadn't confronted Richard, if you hadn't decided to claim this house for yourself. He gestured to encompass the room, now personalized with my books, my photographs, evidence of my life lived on my own terms. So many pivot points where a different choice would have led to an entirely different outcome. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. I think about that sometimes too. How close I came to accepting the role they had cast me in. The elderly mother gradually pushed to the margins, expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. What made the difference? He asked. What gave you the courage to break that pattern? The question deserved careful consideration. I sipped my coffee, gathering my thoughts. Dignity, I said finally. A recognition that I deserved to be treated with basic human respect, regardless of my age or status as a mother. Once I acknowledged that to myself, I couldn't go back to accepting less. Leonard nodded slowly. Dignity. Such a simple concept, yet so profound in practice. It's at the core of everything, isn't it? Our relationship with ourselves, with others, with the world around us. I paused, thinking of Richard's journey, of my own. When we surrender our dignity, when we allow others to define our worth or dictate our place, we lose something essential. And when we reclaim it? He asked, his expression thoughtful. We find ourselves, I replied simply. Sometimes for the first time. We sat in contemplative silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and Baxter's soft snoring from his bed in the corner. Outside, a few last fireflies blinked in the darkness, nature's own string lights complementing those Richard had hung. You know, Leonard said eventually, when I first met you, that day on the hiking trail when you called the ambulance, I remember thinking there was something remarkable about you, a quiet strength behind the politeness. I smiled at the memory of our unlikely first encounter. I was just doing what anyone would do. No, he countered gently. Many would have called for help and continued on their way. You stayed. You made sure I wasn't alone while waiting for the ambulance. You followed up at the hospital. Those choices reveal character. His observation touched me, not least because it highlighted actions I'd taken long before Richard and Vanessa's betrayal, had forced me to reevaluate my life. Perhaps the strength he'd glimpsed had always been there, merely waiting for the right circumstances to fully emerge. "I've been thinking," Leonard continued, setting his empty mug on the side table. "About that trip to the coast I mentioned. The cottage is reserved for 2 weeks in April. Plenty of space for you and Baxter if you're interested." The invitation hung in the air between us, significant in its implications. Not just a vacation, but a statement about our evolving relationship, about possibilities still unfolding, even at this stage of our lives. "I'd like that," I replied, the simplicity of my response belying the butterfly flutter of anticipation it concealed. Leonard's smile deepened, pleasure and relief mingling in his expression. "Good. That's good." Later, after he'd left with a gentle kiss and promises to call tomorrow, I stood on the porch watching his taillights disappear down the street. The night air carried the scent of jasmine from the climber I'd planted along the front trellis, sweet and promising despite the winter season. Returning inside, I moved through the house, turning off lights, straightening cushions, appreciating anew the home I'd created. In the study, I paused before the photographs that had accumulated over the past year. Richard at his promotion celebration, Leonard and me at the symphony, the garden party from earlier today already preserved in digital images Richard had captured. And there, in the center, the photograph that had started it all, the Christmas gathering where I'd been relegated to photographer rather than participant, excluded from the whole family by Vanessa's calculated design. How strange to feel almost grateful for that exclusion. Now, for the pain that had finally pushed me to assert my worth, to reclaim my dignity, to step fully into my own life rather than orbiting around others. That photograph, once evidence of rejection, now served as a reminder of how far I'd come, of the growth that often emerges from our deepest wounds. Upstairs in the master bedroom, I prepared for sleep, the day's events settling into memory as physical fatigue made itself known. Baxter climbed carefully onto his special steps to reach the bed, circling 3 times before settling with a contented sigh at the foot of the mattress. As I switched off the bedside lamp, moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting gentle patterns across the floor. In that peaceful semi-darkness, the wisdom earned through this year's journey seemed to crystallize into its simplest form. Our lives belong to us, not to our children, not to our partners, not to society's expectations. The courage to claim that ownership, to insist upon our inherent dignity regardless of age or circumstance, is perhaps life's most essential lesson, and it is never, ever too late to learn it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.